today we're here to talk about communicating for advocacy. And the aim of this workshop is to discuss how to speak in the public arena and why. Now, looking at how we're going to run this session, we're actually going to start from the why. We're going to do it the other way around. So we're going to talk a bit about the why of public speaking. And in order to get to grips with that why, we're going to look at two things specifically: what advocacy means at Uisg, what it means as part of this project, and also we're going to look at advocacy as ministry, what it can mean in a broader sense, what it can mean within the day-to-day context of our ministry. Then we're going to have our first breakout session, a warm-up breakout, a chance to get to know people in smaller groups. And then we're going to move on to part two, the how of public speaking. So some more practical ideas, some concrete tips for speaking in the public arena. Then we'll have a chance to ask some questions and another breakout session and a chance really to practice some public speaking in smaller groups, which is the aim of the session today. So starting from the why of public speaking, let's have a look at what advocacy means for Uisg. And as part of this project, advocacy is a word which is sometimes used quite nebulously. We use it and we're not quite sure what we're talking about. So let's have a look at what it means to us. The Uisg Advocacy Project, which was launched in July last year, is called Sisters Advocating Globally. Now, I just wanted to pause for a moment to think about the difficulty of using an icon to represent the word globally. Of course, the irony of any icon that represents the globe is that it only ever represents a part of the globe. So I sat here for 10 minutes thinking, which part of the world am I going to show in my icon representing the concept of globally? And eventually I picked this one because I'm in Europe. But one of the things that we want to do as part of this project is unpick some of these concepts. Often we talk about globally and we really mean the global north, or we talk about globally and we're coming from a certain kind of cultural or social situation that we're not really aware of, that we're not taking into consideration. So Sisters Advocating Globally is the title of the project. And I wanted to read together the Uisg Advocacy Vision Statement, which you have here below. This is the statement that we've come up with, that we worked with together on kind of defining, so that we know what we mean when we talk about advocating at Uisg. And the statement says, "We are your sisters. We are committed to advocating for you and together with you, sharing a journey of care for people and for the environment. We believe in a world where everyone experiences a sense of human dignity. And we build our mission on evidence from our work on the ground, inspired by our reflection on the gospel message, the church's social teaching, and the leadership of Pope Francis." So in order to have a more in-depth look, as Patricia was saying, at what that means, we're going to unpack the first 6 lines of that statement to kind of reflect together on what it means to do advocacy in this particular way. So the first line of our statement says, "We are your sisters." And this line encapsulates something crucial about advocacy at Uisg, which is that for us, advocacy is relational. And when we say, "We are your sisters," we're immediately locating ourselves in relation to someone. And that someone really are the local communities that sisters serve all around the world. So this sense of relationality is crucial to advocacy, is something that we've tried to illustrate with the 2 campaigns that we've run up to this point. Some of you may be familiar with these campaigns, may have seen them online or taken part. One campaign was called "You Are My Sister." And this campaign aimed to highlight the amazing work that sisters everywhere have been doing to support local communities through the pandemic. And the other, the more recent campaign, was called "Sisterhood Works." And you can see here we have a great quote from Sister Jessica, who I think is with us today, who said, "As the COVID-19 pandemic goes on, we realized we could not be indifferent to what is happening in the world." So this campaign again aimed to highlight what sisters have been doing during the pandemic, but also more generally to support communities in need. And both these ideas, "You Are My Sister" and "Sisterhood Works," revolve around relationality. Who do we work for? Who do we work with? Who do we work near? So relationality is really the first line and the key piece of our advocacy vision statement. Now, we are committed to advocating, and here is the key question that you often find yourself coming back to, or at least I often find myself coming back to when I talk about advocating. What does it mean to advocate? What activity is that? Well, we've come up with 5 pillars of advocacy, 5 activities which to us describe the kind of core elements of advocacy. One is research, so gathering information, gathering data, gathering stories, witnesses, testimonies. And this is a key part of advocacy, and it's built into our statement again later on when we say we build our work on evidence from the ground. That's what we're doing, really incorporating that element of research, of knowledge. Pillar 2 is policy making. So this speaks more to the aim of advocacy. The aim of advocacy is to create long-term structural change, and often the way to do that is at the policy level. So an activity, an aim of advocacy can be to influence, to create, or to change policy, to change laws, regulations around certain issues. Number 3, alliance building. And again, this one is a really crucial part of advocacy in general and of what we're doing as a project. Advocacy is also about connecting with the people who want to create the same type of change. It's about kind of working together so that we become more than the sum of our parts. It's about creating those networks, creating those partnerships so that people who want to see the same type of change in the world are working together, coordinating their efforts. Number 4, it's about mobilization and empowerment. And empowerment is something we'll talk about a bit more in detail, but it's kind of, the idea of mobilization and empowerment is an idea that revolves around enabling people to speak up for themselves. Sometimes it's our turn to speak up for others who are unable to speak up for themselves in that moment, but ultimately what we want to do is mobilize and empower those who need to speak up for themselves. And finally, the 5th pillar is what we're here to talk about today, communication. Sharing what we know, sharing what we learn, what we see, what we believe, what we experience. Communication is such a key part of advocacy because, as we were saying, advocacy is all about kind of that relationship with the people we serve, but also with the people we want to influence, with the people we want to partner with. So we are committed to advocating for you and together with you. What does it mean to advocate for and with? Well, the way we've come to describe that is as a process of opening the door and then holding it open, holding space for others to come into the room. And this is kind of what I was getting to when we were beginning to think about empowerment. Sometimes we need to advocate for a marginalized group or for a certain community, so we are opening that door. But other times it's their turn to come into the room. And it's important that in that 2-step process, we always have that ultimate aim in mind. I've really been thinking about this 2-part process in the last couple of days. And I think there's another analogy as well, which is kind of a good way to describe it. Imagine that you're sitting in a room full of people and you're sitting next to someone who is too shy, too timid to speak up, or maybe doesn't speak the right language. So you stand up and you speak for them, and that's a valuable and courageous thing to do. But ultimately, when you stand up and speak for them, you're also blocking them. You're blocking them from seeing the audience, from seeing the rest of the room, and you're blocking them from being seen. So at some point, the courageous and valuable act of speaking up, standing up to speak, has to give way to sitting down again and kind of empowering others to stand and to speak. So how do we do this? How do we open the door and then make sure that we keep it open, hold that space for those who need to speak for themselves? Well, we think about the type of language that we use, and this is where we really come to the importance of communication. We want our language to be empowering, focusing on giving people a hand up and not just a hand out that keeps them stuck in the same place. We want our language to be inclusive, things like gender, race, religion, and we want our language to be nuanced. We want the way that we communicate to be nuanced, attentive to holding in balance different ideas that kind of contribute different things, that complement each other. And we'll talk about this a bit more when we look at how we hold in balance, for example, works of charity and works of justice. We'll look at that later on. So, we are committed to advocating for you and with you, sharing a journey of care. And that's really how we would describe the work that sisters do and the place that we come from when we advocate. And we would articulate that journey of care in 3 different connected stages: presence, encounter, and service. Now, presence is a really interesting point because it's something that sisters bring very uniquely into the space of global development, something that really sets sisters apart in a good way from the global development community. Sisters live side by side with local communities and not by the airport, as I once heard somebody describe it. Often, organizations working in the humanitarian sphere arrive with the best of intention in the midst of a crisis, and they set up a camp and they start their wonderful work, but they don't have that presence. They have not already been living side by side with the local community. So that's something really special that sisters bring to the table, a really special way of starting out on this journey. The second step is about encounter, meeting people where they are, as Pope Francis is always telling us. And there's really 3 key elements there for us: respect, solidarity, and collaboration. Respect for human dignity, solidarity with the marginalized and vulnerable, and collaboration with all people of goodwill. And again, that means inclusivity. Sometimes that means people of goodwill who don't come from the same place or exactly the same culture, but who are willing to work with us in that alliance to create the change that we want to see in the world. And thirdly, service. And how do we perform that service? The way we've come to describe it is inclusive, integrative, and integral. Inclusive, we leave no one behind. Integrative, we bring people together and motivate others to move forward. And integral, in the sense of holistic, studying the root causes of a problem and seeking long-term solutions. And again, a key element of advocacy, which we've mentioned and will mention again, is kind of that sense that we're aiming for systemic change, not just to fix the problem today, not just to help one person, but to look at the problem holistically and create long-term systemic change. And finally, our journey of care is for people and for the environment. And we've articulated that into 3 main areas for the purposes of this project. So the idea is that this project will support sisters who are advocating, particularly in one of these areas or several of these areas: healthcare, human trafficking, and integral ecology. And I just wanted to take a break from chatting myself and read a passage that's really of great inspiration to us when we think about how we hold those 2 things in balance: care for people and care for the environment, from the encyclical letter Laudato Si. The human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together. We cannot adequately combat environmental degradation unless we attend to causes related to human and social degradation. In fact, the deterioration of the environment and of society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. For example, the depletion of fishing reserves especially hurts small fishing communities without the means to replace those resources. Water pollution particularly affects the poor who cannot buy bottled water, and rises in the sea level mainly affect impoverished coastal populations who have nowhere else to go. The impact of present imbalances is also seen in the premature death of many of the poor, in conflicts sparked by the shortage of resources, and in any number of other problems which are insufficiently represented on global agendas. So the final point that I wanted to highlight is this sense that human and natural care, that the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together or flourish together. And that's the way that we see these different strands of advocacy as intersecting. We know that care for the planet is care for the people, and vice versa. So now that we've had a look at what advocacy is at Uisg, I wanted to talk about advocacy as ministry. And I'm going to use a few quotes. Many of them come from conversations that we've had recently with sisters and which have been of great inspiration to us. So when we think about advocacy as ministry, one thing that we've realized from conversations with sisters is that there's a general sense that advocacy lives in a box. It lives in a pigeonhole. And if that's your ministry, then you do advocacy. But if it's not, then you don't do advocacy. And that's the assumption that we really want to question. So there's this great quote: "Sisters are trained to understand only one topic, depending on their mission. It's like they're sitting in a closed room and can't see the rest of the house. Although we are sisters, we are part of society." And I found this really inspirational because it really gives that idea of locating advocacy within a broader context. So the idea that we really want to get across and that we really want to share is that advocacy can be part of any ministry. What does it mean to advocate wherever you are? Well, you might work in a school, for example, and advocacy would be speaking to the school's board of governors about a change that you might be able to suggest that makes life easier for children who are on free school meals. Or you might work in a hospital and you might know that they have some great learnings from their emergency department at the hospital across the road, and you might convene a working group to share those learnings, to share those ideas, to brainstorm solutions. Anything that you can do in the place where you are to kind of gather information and channel it towards alliance building and systemic change, anything can be advocacy, really, if you're thinking about change at that systemic kind of networked level. So that's really the first thing that we're here to reflect on, is how sometimes we don't realize that we're doing advocacy because it's not what we're specialized in, but we might be doing it without knowing. And other times we think, oh, I'd love to do advocacy, but I don't have time, I don't have the resources, I'm not able to dedicate myself only to that. Now, one of the aims of this project is also to kind of encourage congregations and superiors to allocate more resources, more energies, more staff to advocacy activities. But the thing that we really want to focus on today is you don't need to be an advocate 24/7. You don't need to be dedicated exclusively. You don't need to be in the advocacy box. You can be an advocate wherever you are. And that's my next point, advocate anywhere. Now, this quote is not from a sister, it's actually by a musician who I really like, and it's about teaching. So, full disclosure, my background is in education as well as communication. I kind of think that education is communication and communication is education, so that's what I've always done. And I love this quote. It's inviting people to be teachers. And he says, be a teacher. Please, please be a teacher. You don't have to do it forever, but if you're in doubt about what to do, be an amazing teacher. Just for your 20s, be a primary school teacher. And even if you're not a teacher, be a teacher. Share your ideas, rejoice in what you learn, and spray it. And I love that image. I love the idea that we can rejoice in what we learn, in what we know, in what we've experienced, and spray it, share it with the world. And I think that really encapsulates, in a way, the kind of advocacy that we want to encourage. You don't have to do it forever. Do it for a while. Do it when you have time, when you're able to, even if you can't commit indefinitely. Rejoice in what you know and share it. Be an advocate. Another key point around advocacy as ministry is the question of global solutions. We live in such a globalized world, in a world where all the challenges that we face and that are faced by the most marginalized and the most vulnerable, all those challenges are interconnected. We've seen already how environmental challenges are connected with social challenges, but really there's that geographical sense as well, that challenges in the US are connected to challenges in Europe, which are connected to challenges in Asia. And this is a quote from a sister we spoke to who is in Latin America, and that's why I've chosen the Americas as my global icon this time. And she said, since human trafficking crimes and networks are transnational, our networks must also be transnational. We need organized sisters to fight organized crime. And I love that idea of a powerful worldwide gang of sisters. But I think she makes a really interesting point, which is, you know, and she's speaking about human trafficking crimes and networks here, but I think this is true of any challenge. She makes the point that all challenges are transnational. And so, you know, those of us who are kind of fighting for change, for progress on those challenges, we must also work transnationally. A couple more points. So coming back to charity and justice and how we hold those things in balance. One of the sisters we spoke to, who is in Asia, said to us, sisters are focused on being holy, merciful, obedient, but advocacy requires us to own our ideas. We want to help our neighbours, but we're not empowered to address the root causes of their problems. We want to work on a model that's not just about needing and giving, but a more sustainable model. Now, I think this is a really interesting, I think this raises a really interesting question. As we were just saying a moment ago, the Catholic Church has this incredible kind of unique selling point, if you like, although that's the wrong word, but it kind of has this incredible position, this incredibly privileged position when it comes to works of charity. And that's something that I've seen, having worked previously with lay NGOs, for example. I've worked a lot in the humanitarian sector, both in the Catholic world and outside of it. And one thing that's unique and valuable and incredibly admired about the way that sisters and the way that the church more broadly responds to humanitarian challenges is its incredible capacity to be there when charity is needed. So if you're working with an NGO and there's a disaster, a typhoon or an earthquake or, you know, another kind of humanitarian crisis somewhere, there's a time lag, there's a delay often there's a delay in seeking the funding for a project to address those needs, and then you don't have presence on the ground. So there's another delay that's more logistical around kind of what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. I've seen that firsthand. And the church and sisters particularly have this incredible presence and this incredible kind of capacity to respond immediately with charity wherever it is needed. So that's something valuable not to be lost, and in fact something to be kind of loudly celebrated. But at the same time, the question is, how do we balance that with also positioning sisters, particularly, which is part of what this project wants to do, positioning sisters as advocates for justice? How do we go beyond the charity, which is still to be valued and celebrated, and look as well at sustainable change? As the sister was saying, a model that's about more than needing and giving, that's about addressing the root causes of a problem and kind of creating long-term change. So I think that's a communication challenge which I find fascinating and which we've been grappling with at Uisg for the last 9 months. How do we communicate in a way that highlights and kind of equally highlights the importance of both those aspects? And finally, confidence. I think this is a really kind of important aspect of advocacy as ministry. Yes, it requires some confidence to advocate. It requires some confidence to speak up. It requires some confidence to perhaps speak to a new audience. But the fun thing about advocacy is that it creates a loop of positive feedback. The more you advocate, the more confident you feel. And this is a quote by a sister in Ireland, who I have a feeling is also with us today. Hello, Sister Eilish, if you're there. And she said, "I can only do what I can with the gifts that I have. I have to believe that my gifts are no lesser than anyone else's." And that's really what advocating is about, because so often that kind of reluctance to step into the advocacy arena can be about confidence and can be about fearing that our gifts are somehow lesser than the gifts of others. But we all have some way in which we can speak up, in which we can speak out. Maybe it's writing, maybe it's public speaking, maybe it's liaising with the media, maybe it's networking, maybe we're great at talking to strangers, and that's how we create the connections that slowly build a network of like-minded advocates for change. Whatever it is that you're good at, and we're all good at something, there is a way to channel it towards advocacy, and we really believe that. Now, of course, advocacy brings its own challenges as well. What are the challenges, the key difficulties that we might face as we step into the advocacy arena? Well, the first and perhaps one of the more immediate challenges that we might face is speaking out without alienating our audiences. So, for example, when we talk about charity and justice, I think that's a really key example. The church is very well known, and sisters are incredibly well known for the charity work that they do. But to talk about justice might be seen as threatening by some. So how do we speak out in new ways to new audiences on new issues without alienating the people who have been listening to us so far? Because really, there's no point opening yourself up to a new audience if the people who were listening to you before turn around and say, "Oh, well, I'm not interested in her now that she does that." So that's a very difficult, very tricky balance to strike. And that balance is not just about the way we come across our audiences, but it's also about the way that we feel. It's also about our identity, our position. It's also an internal reflection. How do we translate our message while retaining our essence? So if we decide that we're going to go and talk about the work that we do in a new arena, for example, with a local politician or with an NGO who might partner with us on the work that we do, when we go and translate our message, which we have to do in order to be understood by a new audience, how do we hold on to the things that are the core of our identity, of ourselves? Thirdly, a challenge, of course, exists around kind of building the platform to advocate on and owning the spotlight. So how do we build the platform? How do we access the spaces where advocacy happens? How do we build credibility in those spaces? And how do we own the spotlight? How do we prepare for unintended consequences? How do we know that we're ready to advocate in those spaces? Those are all questions that we might want to think about. And finally, the question of relationships. So there's a key point around knowing our allies, making sure that we have that strong network when we go into a new space, making sure that we're backed up by the people, the organizations who can be our allies, but also knowing our frenemies. I don't know if you've heard the word frenemies before, but it's basically friends who can sometimes be enemies. And I think in advocacy and generally within the arena of international development, this is a really key point, and actually in the arena of public speaking as well. Sometimes there might be partners, there might be actors, there might be stakeholders, whatever we want to call them, who can be on our side, can help us further our aims, but have their own agenda as well. They're not totally friends because their agenda doesn't always align with ours. They're not enemies either because we can work with them towards a common goal. But how do we identify and how do we juggle, how do we kind of hold in balance those situations where a particular organization or a particular partner or a particular person is allied with us on some issues, but not on others, in some ways, but not in others. I think that's a very key point in this arena. So I'm going to pause my presentation because we're nearing the end of part one and it's nearly time for a breakout session. But first, I would love to come back to the main session, and I would love you all to write in the chat what advocacy is to you in 1 word or 2 words or 3 words, but a very short description of what advocacy might mean to you, given everything that we've talked about in the last half hour. What is advocacy? How would you describe it now? I'm going to open the chat and I'm going to read a few ideas. Oh, power, I love that. Advocacy is power, is empowerment, yes. Standing up, making a stand, making a clear stand, yes. Advocacy is life, I love that. Fearlessness, oh, so nice. To give voice, so many coming in, I can't read them all. Speaking out, solidarity, sharing what we believe, empowerment, possibility, yes. Influence, ooh, dejar ser, I like that, allowing people to be. Compromiso, yes, commitment, empowerment, to take a position, transformation, yes, I love all of these words, and I'm so glad that we'll have the transcript and can use these later on to reflect. Flexibility, yes. Influencing transformation structurally, absolutely. Commitment to transformation, yes. Advocacy is it's about a change for sure. It's about a journey to stand for a cause, to care, to have confidence, to support, to defend. Ooh, cercanía, yes, proximity, closeness. I like that. To listen, that's a very interesting point, of course, and one that we haven't touched on today because there's so much to talk about. But of course, to communicate and to communicate for advocacy is first of all to listen, to hear, especially if you're going to speak for someone else. Yes, to promote living together, to be close to, connect, collaborate. Ooh, dar la palabra, yes, also to kind of give voice, right? To kind of hand the microphone to someone else. Dialogue, empowerment. These are all fantastic. Thank you very much. This is so fun. I should I should have tried this before. It's the first time I'm trying this, but I really enjoy it.